Minhas senhoras, meus senhores, bom dia, bem-vindos aos 108 oradores e moderadores, aos 1500 participantes e assistentes e a todos aqueles que nos acompanham através do streaming para as universidades, na internet e na televisão. Hoje somos muitos. Hoje e amanhã vamos aqui procurar a liberdade em plena liberdade. Como Presidente do Conselho de Administração da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, quero expressar a todos o nosso compromisso com a liberdade e o pluralismo, que gostaríamos que todos utilizassem hoje e amanhã para discutir e pensar o nosso futuro comum. Este é para nós, na Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, um momento muito importante do nosso ano de trabalho. Hoje cumprimos a tarefa prioritária e primordial da nossa Fundação, convidar os portugueses a debater livremente. É para isso que existimos e certamente este encontro enche de orgulho a nossa Fundação. Existimos para prestar um serviço público a Portugal, informar factos, promover ideias e fomentar o debate público. É isso que hoje vamos fazer aqui, hoje e amanhã, para ser livre e ter opinião. Gostaria de saudar e agradecer a presença de todos, em particular aqueles que vieram de longe para se associar ao nosso encontro. Gostaria de começar por cumprimentar o nosso fundador, Alexandre Soares Santos, Presidente do Conselho de Curadores da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. Foi a sua visão estratégica e a sua preocupação com o futuro dos portugueses e de Portugal que levou à gênese da nossa Fundação. Queria também cumprimentar todos os demais curadores, administradores, órgãos sociais da Fundação aqui presentes, muito particularmente os administradores executivos, António Araújo e David Lopes, e o diretor científico Pedro Magalhães, que comigo partilham a honra e a responsabilidade de desenvolver a missão desta Fundação. Distingo também os parceiros da Fundação nesta iniciativa, a TVI, o Diário Notícias, a Média Capital Rádios, a Câmara Municipal de Lisboa, a Accenture, a Jerónimo Martins, assim como tantos outros apoios e colaborações devidamente referenciados na documentação que vos foi distribuída. Queria também cumprimentar o Centro Cultural de Belém, nomeadamente o seu Conselho de Administração, que nos cedeu os espaços para esta procura e viagem da liberdade. Depois do Liceu Pedro Nunes em 2013, voltámos ao Centro Cultural de Belém em 2014, uma casa em que a Fundação se sente bem recebida. É uma honra e um prazer para nós realizar o nosso encontro anual pela segunda vez aqui. Gostaria também de agradecer a todos os que, com a Fundação e na Fundação, com enorme esforço, dedicação e entusiasmo, contribuíram para que este encontro se realizasse. Em particular, o Jaime Gama, administrador da Fundação e comissário do encontro, assim como o Conselho Científico que o acompanhou desde o primeiro momento, a Marina Costa Lobo, a Maria João Valente Rosa, o José Pena do Amaral, o José Tavares e o Gonçalo Almeida Ribeiro. A qualidade e o mérito da escolha dos 108 oradores e moderadores resulta do excelente trabalho que desenvolveram nos últimos 8 meses. Agradeço também à Comissão Executiva do Encontro, dirigida por José Soares Santos, administrador da Fundação, e à Multilem, na pessoa do Pedro Castro. A eles devemos a excelente logística que hoje todos encontramos aqui. Uma palavra muito especial à Teresa Mourão Ferreira, que mais um ano foi incansável na preparação deste encontro. E neste ano, muito especialmente, em que ela levou a sério o tema do nosso encontro de há 2 anos e nos está a ajudar a resolver o problema demográfico. Uma palavra muito especial de justo agradecimento e referência ao anterior Presidente do Conselho de Administração, António Barreto. Ele fez da liberdade a missão principal da nossa Fundação e o centro dos seus objetivos. A construção da liberdade faz-se no encontro de ideias, no debate de ideias, e este não teria sido possível sem o dinamismo que António Barreto imprimiu à nossa Fundação nos primeiros 5 anos de vida. Minhas senhoras e meus senhores, este é o 3º encontro da Fundação. Depois da população e da Europa, chegou a hora de procurar a liberdade. Uma procura absolutamente necessária, num momento muito complicado para a sociedade portuguesa. Enfrentamos hoje aquilo que é, na minha opinião, o maior desafio dos últimos 40 anos. Um processo de empobrecimento relativo, quando ao mesmo tempo impera o descrédito das nossas instituições públicas. Vamos, pois, discutir a liberdade num contexto em que Portugal precisa dessa liberdade para decidir o seu futuro. Vamos debater a liberdade com a seriedade, o rigor, a honestidade intelectual, que são apanágio do nosso projeto fundacional. Vamos pensar a liberdade com uma participação largada de todos. E por isso não estamos numa mera conferência académica. Estamos sim num encontro plural, aberto, vivo e livre. Também por isso queremos evitar o lugar comum político, a demagogia e a mera propaganda, que tanto contribuem e contribuíram para a desvalorização das ideias, para o debate inconsequente e para esse descrédito absurdo das nossas instituições. É por isso que, na minha opinião, a liberdade é hoje um tema perene. Mas é também um mundo diferente e uma sociedade que se transformou muitíssimo nos últimos 40 anos. A liberdade de 1974 será porventura distinta da liberdade de 2014. O que é a liberdade hoje? Mudou essa liberdade e se mudou, para onde vamos? Este é o programa deste encontro. Certamente existem fundamentos sociais, políticos, jurídicos, religiosos, culturais, económicos da liberdade. De tudo isto vamos falar, claro está, durante estes 2 dias. Mas uma das condições para que este debate se possa fazer é a opinião informada de cada cidadão. A opinião que se exprime sem medo e sem temor. E esse é o nosso compromisso aqui hoje. Esse é o nosso encontro. Minhas amigas e meus amigos, procurar a liberdade fecha com chave de ouro o primeiro ciclo de 13 anos dos Encontros Presente no Futuro. Um compromisso assumido pela Fundação em 2012. Assumiremos certamente novos compromissos com o debate público e com a sociedade portuguesa, porque essa é a missão e o papel da Fundação. E continuaremos a trabalhar, e permitam-me que diga, muito particularmente com os mais jovens, que são o futuro do nosso país, porque acreditamos que a população, a Europa e a liberdade foram e são temas fundamentais para construirmos um país melhor. Declaro, pois, aberto o terceiro encontro Presente no Futuro 2014 à procura da liberdade. Tem a palavra o Comissário do Encontro, Jaime Gama. Muito obrigado.
Muito bom dia a todos. Queria apenas dar-vos um sinal sobre o que é a ideia geral deste encontro. Discutir a liberdade, em liberdade e com toda a liberdade. Princípio que tem um primeiro domínio de aplicação na escolha dos oradores. Representam correntes diversas. Todos os debates têm aqueles que sintonizam com perspectivas diferentes à aproximação, à discussão dos problemas. A ideia de liberdade, como surge, como se desenvolve. A ideia de liberdade como se enraiza ou não enraiza em Portugal, na sua história cultural, na sociedade, no seu debate político. E depois os desafios da liberdade no mundo presente, não só no país, mas na sociedade global. E por isso procuramos na Comissão Científica, ao longo de vários meses, elencar quem pudesse contribuir para discutir ideias, trazer um contributo sereno e consistente à discussão deste problema. Não temos nenhum propósito que não seja o de permitir a todos um melhor conhecimento da ideia de liberdade. Não somos prosélitos, não somos cruzados, não somos propagandistas. E, como tal, queremos prosseguir a missão essencial da Fundação, através deste encontro, que é a de conhecer melhor. Conhecer melhor, pensar melhor, para eventualmente poder agir melhor. E é para mim um enorme prazer poder começar esta conferência com Michael Ignatieff, que nos vai trazer aqui o seu contributo, a sua intervenção e os tópicos para uma discussão que queremos ver alargada a todos. Penso que é a altura de Michael Ignatieff possa também subir aqui para, junto de nós, iniciarmos esta primeira sessão de abertura da conferência. Muito obrigado a todos pela vossa participação, muito obrigado pelo vosso contributo e, sobretudo, muito obrigado por terem correspondido da forma como corresponderam ao apelo para vir discutir connosco a ideia de liberdade. Em liberdade e com toda a liberdade. Muito obrigado.
Good morning, welcome. I came in here this morning and thought I was coming to a very small, dusty academic conference full of middle-aged people like me with beards, and I'm very surprised. This is not what I expected at all, and I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be here. I thank you for the welcome. My subject this morning is freedom and the challenge of authoritarian capitalism. I'm going to speak for some time, and then I'm going to put on this ridiculous device, and you're going to ask me questions. I wish I could speak to you in Portuguese, but I can't. Freedom and the challenge of authoritarian capitalism is my subject, and I want to begin by talking about something that those of you who love Sherlock Holmes as much as I do will know what I'm talking about. The dog that didn't bark. There is a dog that didn't bark in this story, and the dog that didn't bark is Portugal. Spain, Greece, and Portugal were the second wave of democratization in the 1970s, and then all three of them, Spain, Greece, and Portugal, went through severe crisis between 2008 and 2014. As we know, economic crisis, severe economic crisis, can be terrible for freedom. And so your institutions faced a very serious challenge in that period. But none of these societies, neither Spain, neither Greece, neither Portugal, turned back to authoritarian, populist, or militaristic solutions. Now, I know that in certain bars in Lisbon, there must have been moments when someone would say, I wish Salazar was back in charge, but it stayed in the bars. It didn't go into the streets. And so you were the dog that didn't bark. And the dog of authoritarianism did not bark in Spain, in Greece, or in Portugal. And I think a very important victory for freedom was won. Liberal democracy is resilient, strong in Western and Southern Europe. It is not strong everywhere, as we shall see. If you go next door to Spain and you look at the current situation in Catalonia, you see another meaning of freedom here that we need to talk about. Freedom as self-determination. Freedom means the self-determination of a majority. What is self-determination? It means the dream of being master in your own house, collective self-determination, and it's a noble goal. But the self-determination of a majority can threaten the political order of a minority, and the self-determination of a group can threaten the national unity of a country. As we speak, the Spanish people, the Catalan people, are faced with very difficult decisions. Their constitution makes it even more difficult. Unilateral referenda, if chosen by the Catalan people, can lead to unilateral secession. And unilateral secession is a recipe for civil war. And so if I said to you that the democracy of the Iberian Peninsula is secure, if I said that democracy is secure in Greece, we cannot be complacent. There is some possibility that conflict between Catalonia and Spain will get out of control. As a Canadian, I have a vested interest in this. I like states to stay together, unless there is violence and oppression that prevents groups from living together. But where there has been freedom together, freedom should be shared and freedom should continue. What's the solution in the Spanish situation? In my view, there's only one: a constitutional referendum agreed by both sides. Up or down, yes or no, in or out. And then you ground freedom in Spain on consent. If you don't ground freedom in consent, freedom can't survive. There may be Spanish people in the audience who will disagree with me, and I welcome a debate with them. My wife is here, and as my wife knows, I am often wrong. Let me make one other reference since we're in Portugal. You are the creators of a global empire. Your empire collapsed in ruins in 1974, and you are now looking out at a very different picture. You're looking out at a Brazil, though independent since the 1820s, is now a democracy. You're looking at Mozambique and Angola that found liberation from colonial rule but did not find freedom. Instead, they found civil war. The Civil War has now been over for 20, 25 years, and these societies have found growth, but they've not found freedom. They are authoritarian capitalist societies in the South. They have discovered that freedom and oil rarely mix. But let me turn now to where the center of my focus. I guess you could call this introductory lecture an attempt to situate the problematic of this conference in a global perspective. I want to talk to you about authoritarian capitalism. Authoritarian capitalism is liberal democracy's chief challenger in the 21st century. These are societies that are capitalist in economic form, authoritarian in their political form, and nationalist in their ideology. I'm referring, of course, to China, to Russia, to the Muslim republics on the southern frontier of the former Soviet Empire. I'm talking about certain African states. I've already referred to Mozambique and Angola. But I'm also referring much closer to home to the country my wife comes from, Hungary. There, in late July, the current Prime Minister of Hungary referred triumphantly to a model of society very different from the kind of society we're trying to defend in Western Europe. He spoke about illiberal democracy, majoritarian democracy. And we know precisely what that means. Thanks to Viktor Orban, we know what authoritarian capitalism looks like. It looks like democratic majoritarian rule without rule of law, without checks and balances, without an independent Supreme Court, without free media, but which calls itself democratic because every 4 years the people are allowed to vote. This is the form of rule that, in my view, poses the most serious challenge to freedom in the 21st century, not just in Hungary, but also in Romania. And it now claims the allegiance of how many people in China and Russia added up? 1.6 billion, 1.5 billion, a lot of human beings live in regimes that are capitalist in economics, authoritarian in politics, and nationalist in ideology. They do not have separation of powers. They do not have rule of law. They do not have checks and balances. They do not have free media. They are very different from the regimes that we knew in the Cold War. I think it's important to notice that there's something new under the sun. Instead of command economics, the state dominating the economy in every phase, setting the prices, you have instead crony capitalism. You have an economy where the chief prices that they depend on, oil, gas, whatever, are determined on a global market. And they seek capital in the global market. Secondly, they have a formal rule by law, not rule of law, but rule by law. That is, the judiciary are not independent, but there is some security of property. This formal rule of law replaces the dictatorship of the proletariat where there's no law whatever. There's even sometimes in some of these regimes formal political pluralism. In Russia, there are a number of parties that compete for power. The only thing is the president's party always wins. There is free media, but the president's media always dominates. Similar pattern can be seen, in fact, in Turkey. This form of rule, authoritarian capitalism, with nominal private freedom combined with public despotism, is something new in the 21st century, and to repeat, it's the chief threat to freedom, in my view, in the modern world. It is also a system that's dependent on foreign capital, and this may be a source of its vulnerability. Now, the point I want to get across, the central point I really want to get across, is the contrast between public and private freedom. These are systems, authoritarian capitalism, where people do have the freedom to own, to accumulate, to transfer property, to start a business. These are important freedoms. These are the capitalist freedoms, vital part of any definition of freedom. In addition, people have the freedom to travel, to exit, to return. I think one of the moments when I most enjoyed the post-89 world was sitting in a resort with my wife in Antigua, or one of those islands in the Caribbean, and suddenly hearing the sound of Russian, and suddenly seeing people with those funny bathing caps they wear in the Black Sea, big sturdy people going in to swim, and realizing that for the first time in my lifetime, Russians were traveling freely overseas. This is an enormously important kind of freedom, but it's not public freedom. Public freedom is the freedom of voice, the freedom of public participation, the freedom of NGOs to organize, to mobilize, to criticize, the freedom of civil society. These societies, China, Russia, Hungary, Romania, Turkey, allow their citizens private freedom, capitalist freedoms, and deny them public freedom. And this is a new bargain, a new division, a new way of maintaining authoritarian rule by allowing some freedoms but not others. And it's an important source of stability for the future. And my point here is that we need to understand the sense in which globalization has enabled authoritarianism. Globalization has made this kind of authoritarianism possible. Because globalization, the spread of global market freedoms, has created a vast middle class in China, in Russia, in Hungary, in Turkey, in Romania. And that middle class suddenly has a stake in a status quo based on public unfreedom. That middle class has a stake in order, and they're willing to sacrifice public freedom in order to maintain that order. And those who want public freedom, and there are millions who want public freedom, they want it in Hong Kong. When you turn on your television every morning, you can see Hong Kong Chinese demonstrating peacefully in the streets of Hong Kong, just as we saw Muscovites demonstrating courageously in 2012. These regimes have become extremely adept at creating small bubbles in which public freedom is expressed, but they're isolated from the rest of the society in such a way that the freedom and the message, the demand for public freedom, is not spread. Hong Kong has been shut off from mainland China. We see the demonstrations, the mainland Chinese do not. I think this requires us to confront certain myths about globalization that we all believed. And I think one of them is the myth of convergence. The idea that global economic interdependence will create a globalized middle class with converging values and interests, that we'll all live in, the departure lounge. We'll all live in that place where we go through Frankfurt Airport or London Heathrow, that sense that we're all a common global middle class. Well, and that produces a convergence of values and interests. And as it produces a convergence of values and interests in a global middle class, it produces a convergence of regimes. That seems to me to have been an illusion. On the contrary, globalization, it seems to me, has stabilized an authoritarian alternative to liberal capitalism. Next to that myth of convergence, I think there's a myth of one world. The One World Alliance. You have airline travel, you are part of the One World Alliance. That's a kind of metaphor for a certain kind of illusion. An illusion that the globalization of technology and markets would produce shared worlds of information. From shared worlds of information, we would have shared values. I think one of the things that has been shocking to all of us, but important, is that the global spread of the internet has not produced a global information commons, a common world of shared information from which convergence of interests, convergence of values, and convergence of regimes could occur. Instead, what we have is autarky, A-U-T-A-R-K-Y. Autarky, separate systems of information that are closed off to each other. The loose talk about one world failed to understand the degree to which Portugal is the limit of its own world, Spain is the limit of its own world, Brazil is the limit of its own world, Canada, my country, the limit of its own world. We're much more in boxes of information that are autarkic to each other than this myth of global convergence would have us believe. And this is especially important politically in places like Russia, China, Turkey, Hungary, Romania, my examples of authoritarian capitalism. You no longer have state control of the media. What you have is the sell-off of the media to the cronies of the regime, and you get the same result. Only they sell advertising. But the result is regimes that have an incredible capacity to create their own reality. Putin creates his own reality. Erdogan in Turkey creates his own reality. When you create your own reality, you create your own constituency. When you create your own constituency, you perpetuate your rule. And all of that is fully consistent with a global internet. And these states are more and more efficient at closing the borders around their societies and isolating them from the free flow of information. And hence it's very hard to imagine an internet-generated challenge to these regimes. These regimes, authoritarian capitalist regimes, then breed their own myth. Their own nationalist ideology is built on a myth of encirclement. NATO is trying to encircle Russia. US and its allies are trying to encircle China in East Asia. The myth of encirclement produces a myth of victimhood. These are big, powerful, stable regimes that feel they are constantly victims of an aggressive, expansionist West. And that sense of victimhood can produce a strong justification for aggression. Encirclement produces victimhood, victimhood results in aggression. And so there are some risks of conflict between Western liberal democratic states that I think have been slow and naive to understand the sense in which they are faced with a new type of regime competitor. And the risks of conflict have been played out in 2014. We've had the forcible alteration of European borders in an area that Russia defines as an area of vital national interest, the near abroad. And so we're looking at, right as we sit here this morning, this is a conference on freedom. Imagine what this conference on freedom would sound like if we were holding it in Kiev. In Kiev, this would not be an abstraction. In Kiev, this would be a discussion about whether liberal democracy can prevail or survive in Ukraine. And the jury is out. It's not certain that it will. Similarly, in East Asia, countries that have taken their own democratic future for granted now look at an expansionist China that is waging unexpected expansionist programs in respect to small rocks in the China Sea that nobody cared about and suddenly happen to have huge amounts of oil and natural gas beneath them. So that we have a more dangerous world. We have a world in which suddenly we have liberal democratic states that fell victim to the myth of convergence, the myth of one world, facing regimes that are consolidated, stable, authoritarian, and yet feel themselves to be victims. Let us be careful not to make China and Russia the same thing or assume that this is anything other than an alliance of convenience. These are two great Asian powers that have been rivals for a very long time, came close to fighting each other as late as 1969. The possibility that they will be in conflict again can't be excluded. But notice that Russia and China have just signed 25-year energy deals with each other. Notice that Russia has in fact conceded Chinese hegemony in East Asia. Notice that China and Russia vote the same way in relation to overthrowing the Syrian dictatorship. Notice the sense in which they line up geostrategically to oppose almost anything proposed by Europe and the United States. These are territorial rivals, allies of convenience, who have joined up to face and defy the liberal Leviathan being the United States. So, are we in a Cold War? I don't think so. That's not where I'm taking you to. I'm not going to pound the table and urge you backwards into the sterile divisions of the Cold War. Global war is out because of nuclear weapons, but proxy war is in. Proxy wars in Syria, proxy wars in eastern Ukraine, in which the great powers confront each other through proxies, makes for a much more unstable future. I think the thing that is different about the Cold War from the Cold War period is the sense in which these regimes, China and Russia, need globalization as much as we do. That, it seems to me, is a new fact. The degrees of global interdependence make their calculations different than they were in a world in which the two communist and free worlds were autarkic to each other. They need capital, they need access to markets. These are levers which we can use, and we have been using in the sanctions regime. The thing that we have to understand, and this is a simple thing to understand but hard to get into our guts, is a global order is a plural order. A global order is not a world in which history is over and liberal capitalism triumphs everywhere. It's a world, in fact, in which we face two alternative paths into modernity, one which is liberal capitalist democracy, and the other is capitalist authoritarianism. These are the two competitors for the allegiance of the world in the 21st century. And the task of leadership is to manage a plural order in which we have to find ways to agree to disagree. We can't convert them, we can't use force against them, but we definitely have to prove that liberal democratic modes of organizing human freedom are better than theirs. Global order depends on managing that disagreement, making deals, and emphatically not making war. I want to conclude, because I hope we have time for discussion. The one thing I take away from my own expose, and I hope you will too, is the sense that we have to get our house in order. We have to understand the sense in which we've got work to do at home. It's not merely that we're probably going to have to spend more on defense. If you don't want American domination in Europe, then you're going to have to pay for it. It's just not complicated, but that's just something that has to be understood. But we have a conflict between private freedom and public freedom. We have young people in this audience right across the world, right across the liberal world. Participation rates in public life have been declining steadily since I was 18 years old. When I was 18 years old in my country, Canada, 80% of the population voted in federal elections. Now the percentage is down below 60%. That's happening everywhere. In other words, a gulf is opening up in our societies between private freedom and public freedom. The young generation has more private freedom than at any time in history. The capacity to work and live anywhere in the world, the capacity to live and work and use technologies that weren't even imagined in my lifetime. This is an extraordinary opportunity, but it appears to have been sheared away from an equivalent desire for public participation. We also face the problem of oligarchy. We face the problem of the domination of money over liberal democratic systems. I teach in a university. Many of your speakers teach in universities. The job of universities is to make sure that our oligarchies are broken open and face the competition of meritocratic selection. I teach at Harvard. I'm proud to teach at Harvard. But I don't want Harvard to be the systematic reproduction of a closed oligarchy based on inheritance and wealth. If we're going to have elites, they've got to be the smartest elites we know how to create, and they have to be elites that are genuinely open to the talents right from the bottom of the society. A society that is not meritocratic, that isn't relentless about finding the best and the brightest from every sector of society, is a society that's going to decline. So we need to confront our problem of oligarchy, because if we don't confront our problem of oligarchy, all kinds of ordinary Portuguese, ordinary Canadians, ordinary British people will say, this system is not for me. The door of access to this system, to public power and private wealth, is closed to me. When those doors are closed, we have a problem of stability, order, and justice, which we have to confront. And so we have a competitor abroad, and we have a challenge at home, and I hope this introductory lecture has helped us to focus on what we should talk about in the next few days. Thank you for your attention. And now I put on my ridiculous rabbit ears, and I wait to see whether there are questions. The thing about questions, not a lot of people know this. A question is a short interrogative statement followed by a question mark. That's the thing we're looking for here, a short interrogative statement followed by a question mark. I'm looking, I can't see anything. I need direction and assistance. A question. Don't be shy. I see a question down there. Don't be shy.
Bom dia. Desculpe fazer-lhe a pergunta em português. Fiquei com a ideia ao ouvi-lo que nos estava a chamar a atenção com o lindo exemplo do cão do Sherlock Holmes, que temos que ter uma grande humildade na maneira como analisamos os processos do implícito, quando o nosso mundo tantas vezes nos engana com o explícito. Será um pouco isso que nos quis dizer?
I think my story about Sherlock Holmes was just to say that many countries with authoritarian pasts, faced with severe economic difficulty, can go backwards. The authoritarian past in Portugal is close. The authoritarian past in Greece is very close. The authoritarian past in Spain is very close. And none of these societies took that path backwards. And I just wanted to say that the social scientists might have expected that faced with economic difficulty, faced with economic fragmentation, faced with crisis, it might have been tempting to take authoritarian solutions to Portugal's problems. And yet that was not the path that was taken. The path that was taken wasn't perfect. I'm not here to sing the praises of actual or existing politicians in Portugal. I'll leave that to you. I'm just saying a certain dog, a big, nasty, authoritarian dog with big teeth, didn't bite. And that's a good thing. There's a question over here. I should make it clear in taking these questions, there is no justice whatever here. It's random. There.
Sorry, it's just a brief question. Thank you for your lecture. I just wanted to ask if you think that the way the West, push for freedom all over the world can contribute to diminish freedom in the world.
There may have been some implication of that in the previous question. I know I sound like an arrogant American democracy-promoting cold warrior, but I'm actually a Canadian herbivorian, peace-loving, humble person. But equally, and with respect, I see no point in apologizing There's a point in being humble about freedom. Yes, humble about freedom, honest about our difficulties, focused above all in getting our own house in order, focused above all in living up to our own commitments, realizing that in many respects our societies do not live up to the values that we propose. And there's a difference between that, which seems to be honest and humble, and refusing to defend freedom when other people demand it too. It would be very disappointing, for example, as the Hong Kong students demonstrate today, if we did not give them signs of support. They're fighting our battle. They're fighting a battle that every student can recognize. The desire to elect your own people free of external coercion. And in that sense, to the degree that that's a universal value, I think we should defend it. The critical thing, in answer to your question, you cannot impose freedom where it is not desired and sought. But where it is desired and sought, you should stand with the people who desire and seek it. Down here.
Obrigada pelas palavras inspiradoras. Graças a Deus, não há um mundo de convergência. Convergência é uma ilusão. Mas a pergunta é esta: existe uma possibilidade para pluralismo e, simultaneamente, uma sociedade civil global? É possível conciliar isso, em seu entender?
That's a very good question, a question about whether it's possible to have a global civil society. It relates in a sense to the previous question. A global civil society is meaningless if by that you mean we're all promoting the same things. I think what we're trying to do is, in global institutions of civil society, international NGOs, for example, to create a platform in which we negotiate difference, in which we share difference, in which we come to respect difference, in which we understand the wisdom of different strokes for different folks. But where also, to get back to the previous answer, where someone is being beaten, where someone is being oppressed, where someone's freedom is being denied, we stand up for them. So it's a story of solidarity and pluralism, not just pluralism, but solidarity. I have been reading the biography of Václav Havel, the great Czech statesman. It's important to remember how important it was to those Czech dissidents in civil society, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in the 1980s, to receive any sign from the other side that they were being heard and listened to. It made a huge difference to Havel that he had support in Germany, that he had support in France. And it will make a huge difference to the Hong Kong dissenters, the students, to feel that this audience cares about them, is wanting them to succeed, wanting them to avoid violence, wanting them to avoid needless provocation, wanting them to avoid disaster, i.e., wanting them to show political wisdom. And what they want may not be what we think they should want, but what they want is what matters. And we can recognize in what they want something that is entitled to solidarity and support.
Muito obrigado. Deu vários exemplos, não só de países onde os cães ladraram, ou o cão, mas também de países que têm problemas de portanto, províncias ou partes desses países querem ser independentes e disse que, como canadiano, preferia que os países ficassem inteiros. A minha pergunta é, o que é que pensa da Europa? Acha que a União Europeia é uma coleção de Estados, que há uns cães de vez em quando que ladram? Qual é a sua ideia da Europa? Tem uma ideia da Europa, para ser até mais provocativo? Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Well, here I'm an outsider. I don't live the daily frustrations that political elites across Europe live with European regulation, European interference. I was in a cab last night and heard a Portuguese student tell me that when Portugal joined the European Union, you had to cut back on your fishing fleet. You're very proud of your fishing fleet, and now look back at the cost, the price that you paid for joining Europe was the loss of an industry that goes back 6 centuries. Well, I think every country will tell a similar story of frustration. But I am, as an outsider, struck by the enormous strength of the European Union in crisis. Just imagine what Portugal would have gone through had you had your own currency, you were on your own. I think the European Union proved during the crisis the capacity to be a shock absorber. And on the one hand, a shock absorber, but on the other hand, forcing you to make changes you didn't want to make. One of the interesting lessons of the European crisis is that European integration forces elites to do things they don't want to do, but which are in the interests of the country. Greece is the great example of this. There is a way in which European constraints on Greece force the elite to deal with tax evasion, force the elites to deal with corruption, force the elites to take certain steps that they couldn't take. And the great thing about European constraints is the local elites can then blame someone else. It's the damn Germans, right? It's great. Democracies need safety valves of that kind because politicians don't want to take responsibility. Sometimes it's a useful democratic safety valve to blame someone else. So, on balance, I think the European experiment has supported and sustained democracy, and if I said the dog didn't bark, one of the reasons the dog didn't bark is that you have the European Union. Doesn't mean it's fully democratic, doesn't mean it doesn't need reform, doesn't mean that there isn't huge resentment across Europe, including in Germany, about the undemocratic character of European institutions. I hope Europe has had a warning signal about its need to democratize further in the future.
Good morning. I was just wondering if we take as a reference not only your comment on the Spanish situation, but even the Scottish referendum, what is your opinion on the fact that maybe democracy is limiting freedom to the opinion of a majority and ignoring the minority then? Thank you.
That's a great question, and I take the aspirations of the Catalan people to autonomy very seriously, as I take the aspirations to autonomy of my French-speaking compatriots in Canada. Je parle français. Mon sens du Canada, c'est que nous sommes un pays bilingue. This interpenetration of our political cultures is part of what I think Canada is. That's not an answer to your question, but my sense about the self-determination problem in Catalonia is that we think of the problem as if there is an overwhelming majority in favor of separation in Catalonia, in favor of independence. We don't know because there's no constitutional process for a referendum. My recommendation, in fact, is it is crucial for the Spanish Parliament and the Spanish courts to find a constitutional way to consult the Catalan people about their future. You can't keep people in a country against their will. The foundation of liberty and freedom is consent. But the point I want to put an emphasis on, and here I feel very strongly, is they are a lot of people who feel they are both Catalan and Spanish. Just as in my country, there are people who are both Quebecers and Canadians. Just as in Scotland, there were people who felt they were Scottish and British, equally. My objection to separatism in Europe is that it's especially hard on people with divided loyalties. And I suspect that the people with divided loyalties are actually the majority. I'm not against secession in cases where there has been violence, where people have been compelled to remain in a state by force, where there has been active oppression, where there has been brutality. People, it seems to me, will do what they're going to do, which is secede, and we've seen that in Europe. But in a case in which, as in Catalonia, they have lived within a constitutional order that has not been oppressive, that has allowed them to speak their own language, retain their own culture, and done pretty well in the financial deal, the cost of separation in this case is that it will cut people down the middle. And my sense of politics is that there are some choices you should never force a person to make. And one of those is you should never force a person to choose between parts of their soul. If you're asking me why I have strong feelings about this, it's that. Not that I'm unsympathetic to Catalan desires for more autonomy, more freedom within a constitutional settlement. I'm concerned about all those people I meet in Barcelona who feel a little bit Spanish, a little bit Catalan. Some days they feel more Spanish, sometimes more Catalan. When Barca wins, they feel more Catalan. You know, when the Spanish team wins at the World Cup, they feel more Spanish. Hey, that's the identity I want to speak for. And that's the identity that is asked to cut themselves in two in these choices. And the result of these things is that, you know, what is secession about? It's so Arthur Mas can be a big fish in a small pond. Does that justify this? I don't think so.
Muito bom dia. Li há dias um texto que dizia: quando há pobreza, não há liberdade. Quando não há liberdade, não há cidadania. Quando não há cidadania, não há democracia. Gostava que comentasse. Obrigado.
I think you make a very important point. Equality of citizenship, equality of rights, the right to vote, is meaningless if you feel that it will make no difference to your economic situation. And you can't talk about a community of citizens which is divided between the very rich and the very poor. There has to be a connection in our understanding of freedom. There has to be a connection between the idea of civic equality, the equality of citizens, and social equality. And then we have a big argument about what social equality means. And this is where our political parties divide. There are some people who think that it is the business of government to equalize social conditions through taxation, other things. I've always taken the view that you pay a price in freedom when you do that. And the balance here is to find a way in which, as I said at the end of my speech, you have absolutely meritocratic systems of social promotion. There is inequality. Some people are more successful than others. Some people make more money than others. Some people have more money than others. But no one feels excluded by the conditions of their birth. That, it seems to me, is the crucial thing. And it's not just important for democracy, it's terribly important for innovation. I mean, I'm a teacher by profession. And the thing that haunts me about all of our societies, Portugal, Canada, is the sheer number of human beings that we waste. The sheer number of people who feel their life is over before it even begins. Poverty is not just absence of income. It's absence of hope, absence of opportunity, absence of self-esteem and pride. And a liberal democratic society that cares about freedom cares about that problem. How do we make sure that every child in every school in Lisbon gets up in the morning and thinks, it could be me, you know? I've got a life to make with my two hands, you know? She may be richer, he may have a bigger car, but I'm going to be the Prime Minister of Portugal, actually, right? That feeling of opportunity and hope is what you have to create in a society. So to that degree, sir, I agree strongly with the general drift of what you're saying.
Última questão.
Bom dia. Sob um ponto de vista mais abstrato, sobre um ponto de vista mais abstrato, não lhe parece que as democracias ocidentais possam vir a ser vítimas do seu próprio conceito de liberdade? Eu dou como exemplo, qualquer comunidade islâmica pode construir uma mesquita em qualquer país ocidental e, no entanto, acho praticamente impossível construir uma igreja cristã em qualquer país islâmico. Isso, enfim, tem todas as consequências que se estão a verificar agora no Médio Oriente. Qual seria a sua opinião sobre esse assunto?
Well, we've got a big job to do to make sure that every person who comes into Portugal, everybody who comes into Canada feels that they've got a chance, they've got an opportunity, that they've got hope. Relates to the previous question. I feel particularly strongly about that in relation to Muslim arrivals in our country. They are tormented, many of them, by the fact that a tiny, tiny extremist minority give them all a bad name, and that's difficult for them. I think it's important that we allow them to build, not merely allow, wrong word, encourage them to build mosques. What we have to insist on the other side is a quid pro quo of, here are the rules of our game. You've come to our society, this is how we do it. Freedom of speech, equality of rights for women, equal access to education for men and women. You come here, you're welcome, you're part of our society, but we have rules and you do have to comply. I'm quite integrationist in that sense. The thing I would be concerned about is a democracy where we ghettoize into separate communities that never speak and never interact, and there's far too much of that in Europe. But all I can say from my own society, Canada and North America, is that the Muslim faith and Muslim communities have made an incalculable contribution to our societies, incalculably enriched our societies. And yes, in other countries, Muslim authoritarian regimes do not allow churches to be built. There is persecution of Christians. And we need to speak out very strongly against that. We are watching these very days the deliberate extermination of Ottoman multiculturalism in the Middle East. That is, the persecution of the Christians, the persecution of the Yazidis, the wiping out of an ancient form of multicultural tolerance that existed in the Middle East. at the hands of Salafist and Wahhabist fanatics. That's another problem. And we should not allow that problem to change our welcome and our incorporation of those who come here. I'm the son of immigrants, so I take this stuff very strongly. My father came to Canada with nothing, and I then had a good life in that country. I have a deep allegiance to the idea that freedom is indivisible. The minute people come and become citizens in our country, they must, it is a matter of honor, but it's also a matter of strategic calculation. They must be treated as full equals, and on the other side, there are rules of citizenship to which they must comply. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.